Hello and welcome along or welcome back to the Dads in Business video podcast series. My name is Rob Taylor from Dads in Business, where we aim to help busy working dads bring the best of themselves to work and to home. As part of that, obviously we have the little ones running around. We might be expecting kids arriving soon, or the kids might be growing up. And with that comes challenges about how they themselves approach life, how we want to set our kids up for success. It's something I challenge myself to do, struggle with sometimes, want to talk more about. And luckily, I found just the person to do that today. Han-Son from Daddilife has literally written the book around the growth mindset for kids. And that's what we're going to talk about today, developing that growth mindset for our kids and helping set them up for success. Han-Son, I'm delighted you've joined us. Give yourself a bit of an introduction. Who are you? Where are you from? And what the heck do you do?
Will do. Firstly, thanks so much for having me on, Rob. Really, really appreciate it. So hi, everyone. I'm Han-Son. I am a very proud dad to a very boisterous 8-year-old. I'm the founder of Daddilife, which is the UK's largest content platform for modern-day dads. We are a 3-time now best-selling book publisher and a consultancy exclusively focused on dads at work.
Brilliant. Excellent. And why is that, Han-Son? Why dads specifically? What lit a fire under you to help dads specifically in that space?
Yeah, it was about just over 7 years old now. And to be really honest, Rob, I set it up because I knew I wanted to be a very different dad to what I had growing up. And everywhere I looked, there were a great number and some brilliant sort of dad blog resources, but there wasn't necessarily anything that was, I guess, focusing on the overall generational shift of fatherhood and what modern day fatherhood is, and what I think it will continue to grow to be still. So Daddilife actually started as a kind of very small social community. It's kind of grown since then. We have a really big and thriving web platform. And over the last couple of years, we've ventured into book publishing just to focus in on certain areas where we can really go a little bit deeper on. And as you mentioned, growth mindset being for us, and I guess, to be honest with you, we started planning this book probably a good 2 years ago, actually, which yeah, I know this seems crazy, but it was really struck after a bit of an epiphany in the team that one of the things that I think is going to be so different in our fatherhood and perhaps our parents, guardians' journey with us is that everything has felt quite linear in education terms, in terms of when we were growing up, you went to school, you essentially went to university or had some sort of level of higher education, got a job, you might switch those roles around every few years, but everything was quite linear, you retire, etc. Well, it's actually for our kids' futures, everything is in such disruption, to be short about it. So even the value of university education, the sorts of jobs people are going to have, more kids want to be YouTube influencers now than sort of more traditional careers that we were probably aspiring to growing up. But even education, the way and how and why our kids are taught is so different to how we were. And so everything is in flux in some way in terms of that traditional linear path. And actually the thing that we felt 2 years ago and still now is that what we can do to really set up our children for success is actually having the power and that mindset of adaptability, because it's the children who can not only grow with their mindset now for their present results and their progress, but also how we set them up for that in the future. And that fundamentally is the mission of the book, to really empower parents and children to think about not just a fixed mindset, but also a growth mindset.
Well, brilliant. I always love speaking to people like yourself where they've come from a sort of either lived experience or a real purpose that drives that change. It sounds like you've got a real mission, and it's exciting to know more about it. You mentioned there just in your introduction about you've noticed there's a generational shift.
Yes.
I wonder what you mean by that. What have you observed that's showing through? What have you seen?
Yeah, I think what we've seen, and we've done lots of research on it as well, is that we have essentially a turning of the tide, I guess, in terms of parental expectation, parental behavior, where, a few decades ago, maybe even last decade ago, there would have been a lot of expectation that the primary carer is, and traditionally, And in some cases, many cases, is still mum.
Mm.
I think what we've seen is that dads are playing a far more active role in day-to-day parenting. And that starts, right from birth, taking care of more routine, just fundamentally being more present, more active. The benefits for our children is enormous of that. But I think what we're seeing in this growth towards becoming a more equal parent, that there's a number of things that are still quite unequal. And I think actually dads at work being one of them. And I know you and I are both really, really passionate about that area because the world of work has been relatively slow really to adjust to that reality. And even though the government have put in place schemes like shared parental leave, and we can go, can talk for days about why that did or didn't work necessarily. But what we've seen is that as an impetus, there's a lot of leading organizations now driving that agenda faster forward and actually starting to treat dads like an equal caregiver, which is so important because it's what really has driven a lot more modern day dad attitudes. And I think we have to say too, COVID has been, in a lot of cases, an accelerator of that as well. In that I often say that when you think about dads who became dads for the first time over COVID, depending on the industry they were working in, they likely haven't known anything but working from home, with their babies for a good 2 years. And so actually that's why when we talk about now transition back to the office, we talk about different ways of working. It's such a huge adjustment for such a bigger population of dads, and not just new dads, but I think more perhaps traditionally based dads who perhaps for the first time in a while got to see a different way and potentially don't want to go back to the way things were. So I think there have been a number of shifts, and this started pre-COVID, but I think COVID has definitely accelerated a lot of those things as well.
Yeah, we often say in other spaces of the work that I do that COVID, it's not necessarily changed things; it's just accelerated what was happening anyway, and that, in a way, is an opportunity that COVID brings, isn't it? Is to open that up, but it's perhaps a bit of a shock to the system for some, especially workplaces and leadership where traditional businesses don't allow that shake-up of work to happen. Also, you mentioned about how kids are growing up in this muddled up world. It's crazy, isn't it? We're one of my biggest differences that I anticipate, I think, is from when I was young, there was no tech. I grew up in a time where mobile phones weren't a computer in your pocket. My first mobile phone when I was 15, you could literally send a text from it. Now my 8-year-old, as you alluded to, wants a YouTube channel. Well, he's got a YouTube channel. He wants his heroes, if you like, are YouTubers. It's crazy, and it's changed, and they can all use tech and they can all talk with their friends through screens. Things have changed, and I think we have to, we can't stop the change, so we have to allow that to happen, but it's how we as parents behave and how we can set the kids up to respect boundaries, and I guess that ties into our discussion today around the mindset of things, because there is endless potential for our kids to do whatever they want to do. And it's interesting you mentioned about I don't want to go to university, I want to be a YouTuber. I wonder how that's going to play out in 15 years' time. It's incredible, isn't it? But I think in terms of the mindset conversation, there's two broad mindsets that we have. And if we could just try and unpack a little bit at the highest level what we mean by a mindset and what we mean by a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. It might be a new concept to some listening. So how are they supposed to teach it to their kids? So if we can just maybe at the highest level define what we mean when we talk about that, I think it will help the conversation as we go through.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think at a broadest level, mindset is about the way we mentally approach something. So when we're tasked with a challenge, when we encounter a problem, when we've got an issue, when we've got a task even, what is our mental approach to that? Some of us have a very set approach to that thing. I journal a lot, for instance, and I sort of, in my sort of day to day, I quite like putting things in certain segments, and almost that helps me get things through. But for others, that would be an absolute nightmare. So I think it's going to be your mental approach to whatever you're doing. I think the term growth mindset actually came about from a lady called Carol Dweck, first of all, a few years ago, where she had coined this term growth mindset. And fundamentally, growth mindset, in its simplest terms, is about a belief that you can get better at something and that you can do things in a different way for a different result. And that's fundamentally, in its most layman's terms, what it is. I think why that matters more than ever is because we are often taught, whether by accident or on purpose, and sometimes very subconsciously as well, particularly for children, to have quite a fixed mindset to things. And a fixed mindset is the converse of that. I think it's important to say a fixed mindset isn't necessarily a bad thing, in the same way growth mindset isn't necessarily the enigma of everything, but it's just always good to understand your mental approach to something. So when you have a fixed mindset, particularly for children, it tends to be more of a belief that you can't change and you can't grow in a different way, and that you can't necessarily adapt, and things are the way they are. And I think more so than ever, things aren't just the way they are, and that actually there are scenarios and solutions and situations where our kids have the opportunity to be more adaptable to changes around them. And so the book, it breaks down the 6 key principles of growth mindset, but done in a way that's actually applicable to children. So everything from actually even just understanding how the brain works, fundamentally. When our kids understand how our brains work, they can actually start to put the pieces together themselves in terms of saying, well, actually, this is why I think like this, and this is the part of the brain that controls how I think, how I talk, how I hear, how I sense. So then the power of mistakes, the power of yet. Power of yet is one of my favorite principles, because it's about saying it's not so much that you can't do something, it's about they can't do something, comma, yet. So, even if you think about our children today, I have an 8-year-old, you have an 8-year-old, they might say, well, I can't drive. It's like, yeah, you can't drive yet. Or you can't build that particular game. Well, no, so you can't build that particular game yet. And just that power of that word is incredible, because it immediately doesn't shut down a conversation, it opens it up. And I think particularly for an age where our children they've gone through a lot. I think it's often it's a thing I think I see so visibly all around me, in terms of my own son's friends of friends, the networks, the dads that we see with their children. That children have gone through a lot with COVID themselves, and I think there have been record numbers that have gone through quite a shake-up. It's knocked their confidence. It's probably made children on the whole a bit more anxious. It's sort of stunted certain social skills. I think that's why more than ever, growth mindset is so important to just. I hesitate to use the word retrain the brain. It's not that, but I think just show that something is possible. That actually there's another resource here, another tool that can help break through some of that confidence and through some of that anxiety. And a lot of that is about that internal mindset.
Interesting. I think, yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, COVID, we don't know what the impact of that's going to be on our kids, I guess, for another few years, do we? But I certainly see my youngest, who's 4, he's never really, I guess he's never really seen what proper school is yet. He didn't go, he didn't get to meet people. And we notice in him, he's not as social necessarily, or he's quite social, but he's quite young in how he socializes. He's not the same as what the other, my middle one, who's now 6, he's not the same as that. And you just realize what they've missed out on, and how that might dampen things down, because I guess they were told, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that during that period of time of lockdowns. You can't go to school, you can't see your friends, you can't do this. So that must have really challenged that approach to mindset. And I love that power of yet. I think that's a great example. You can't go out yet. It does, it really opens it out mentally, doesn't it? It's it's a brilliant concept. And I think I was going to ask Han-Son, do schools help with this? Does the school system as it is today help with this? Or is it a school's there to tick boxes and put kids through a system, or are schools there to develop a kid's mindset and show them that potential of what might be? A controversial question.
No, it's a really important question, and it's probably it's a big, tough question. It probably depends who you ask, and I'm feel quite fortunate in that my own son's school does teach growth mindset and truly believe in it, and you can see it in how the children approach things. But I know that's not true of every school, and I think there is an education shake-up happening at the moment where, even at its very broadest, I think schools and the way schools are measured means that sometimes things get taught that are, I don't want to say tick boxy because that feels very disrespectful, but I think perhaps more traditional and more in line with what a traditional curriculum would look like. But those traditional curriculums won't necessarily always serve the whole child for a whole future. And I think that's the thing. I think if we think about our education system, it was designed in such a way where it pointed us to certain traditional careers. You know, even in terms of course, maths and English are fundamentally important for day-to-day life, but in terms of some of those wider subjects, particularly when you do the transition from primary then to secondary, a lot of those are kind of geared towards more traditional careers, and those traditional careers are just not really going to exist. I think that's why we see now a lot more schools, you know, investing in IT. They invest in teaching our kids to code, but you could argue that even that's not enough, and that actually there's a lot of supplementary resources online and groups that actually help really advance our children. And I think that's why we sort of wrote this book, was just to say skills and areas and AI and everything, all of that is coming down the road. And I think a bit like, you know, when we were talking off air about our own career paths, we've had to be adaptable to a certain degree, you know, and I think when we go through our careers, we will look back and say we probably had to retrain maybe 2, maybe 3 times, maybe. Our children will be saying at least 10, if not more, because everything will be in flux, you know, even, and sorry to go a bit deep here, but even the way that we pay for things, even the way that we transact. You know, I think it was really interesting to see yesterday's announcement about the Bank of England looking at the digital pound. I've been looking at that announcement for a while because everything will change, you know, in terms of blockchain, in terms of just how things will get processed and transacted and how our children will grow up in that environment. So, you know, we talk about how we grew up and sort of have to learn mobile and tech. Our children are going to sort of learn and grow up in blockchain and all the possibilities that that's going to bring. And so that's why the blockchain is only that. There'll be something else in 10 years that eclipses that. And then something else in 5 years after that, that eclipses that. So there will be, I estimate, at least 10 transitions that our children will have to make. And so that's why that mindset of adaptability is so important, particularly now, because if we wait until they are 17, 18, it's almost too late. They already have a certain foundation of what they think they can and can't do. What we need to do is get them thinking about the power of adaptability right now.
And are you seeing schools? I mean, it sounds like your kids' school are trying to do things. I mean, do they actively? How do you know that your kids' school is teaching that growth mindset approach? Do they have a sit-down lesson about it, or is it just a culture within the school? Because I don't think my kids have a sit-down lesson about the growth mindset. Like they don't have a sit-down lesson about money management. They don't have a sit-down lesson about content creation. All these things that will probably be of more benefit don't exist. But do they in your kids' school?
So growth mindset is something that is definitely more cultural. So it's something that the head teacher talks about. It's something that actually is it's interwoven really in the fabric of the school in terms of even just how they're rewarded. So when they get merits, they get called out for things that are actually about growth mindset fundamentally. So they kind of get rewarded for that as well. But that's not to say they punish fixed mindsets. I think it's just important to understand when one is appropriate for what situation. That's his school in particular. I think there are other schools that are, you know, as I said, more traditional, and that's fine. But I think it's one of those things where, as a working parent, we're busy. We're always busy. But of course, at the heart of why we're busy is for our kids and our kids' futures. And I think that's why the book, for us, was so important to write, because, as you mentioned before, there are times where we know we have to supplement our children's education, and there's a lot we can do in terms of workbooks, in terms of, you know, handwriting practice or math skills or money management. There's those traditional subjects, and they're great. And, you know, I've got some, and we've used them before. But I've always felt that they don't really tackle the bigger why. it's a bit like the Simon Sinek,
Yeah,
why, how, what, almost. I kind of feel like those workbooks often they tackle the what,
yeah.
they tackle the how, but they don't always tackle the why. And I think that's kind of the why, no pun intended. I think this workbook is about the why. It's really about fundamentally whether it's this skill, this technique, this area, this learning. If you don't have the mindset to actually embrace all those things, then actually
What's the
that's
point?
only as
Yeah.
good. Exactly. So I think that's for us. This is kind of the workbook for the why as much as anything.
That's a real good catch, yeah, about it's always do this, the tactical bits. It's like, well, what's the point? If I don't believe in why I'm doing it, I'm not going to do it, and it'll get boring, and it becomes a
Exactly.
chore. I'm not going to do things that are a chore. It's that's a real good point. I'm glad you raised that about let's dig down into the why and the crux of the issue. I mean, let's move it a bit closer to home. We touch on the school system and how they might encourage that growth mindset in our kids at school, but at home, our kids are little menaces, aren't they? They watch everything. Someone once said to me on another chat I was doing on this series where they said our kids might not listen to us 100% of the time, but they watch us 100% of the time.
100%.
So
100%.
I guess the question here is, they might watch our behaviors, and if our behaviors is that of a fixed mindset or a growth mindset, do they learn from us through watching that, or do they need to actually get their hands on something and do it? Are their beliefs almost transferred in that behavioral way, or is it through practice that they'll start to develop these skills?
It's a really good question. I guess at the heart of that question is also how much of our own mindset do our children observe? And I guess it depends how we communicate our mindset. So if I think about my own son, what does he observe me do? He's definitely seen me do work. He's seen me do play. He's seen it when we play together. He's seen it when we learn together. He's seen me cook. Like he's seen me do everything really. Cooking, cleaning, go to the toilet. Like honestly, there's no sort of airs and graces.
Yeah. But does he know why you're doing that? To go back to the previous point and raise him out the why, he sees you doing these tactical things. Does he know why you're doing them?
I think he does. He definitely knows why.
Not
I
the
think
toilet one.
possibly a build on that question. Yeah, yeah. I'm going to the toilet because
Yeah.
that I think maybe a build on that question there as well is, does he know if he can do it himself in the future? And does he understand that actually getting to a certain place, for me anyway, has certainly taken a lot of mistakes. And it's something I've noticed actually about how kids, and there is one chapter especially that's got a number of activities about mistakes and about how mistakes are just new opportunities. And I think the thing about mistakes is I see a lot of children who take mistakes very personally. And they'll make a mistake and it'll be, well, therefore I can't do that. And actually, no, it's not that. Actually, if we reframe that mistake as what we learned from it, and actually the opportunity learned from it, and that's why we actually talk in the book about some of the most famous inventions in the world came from mistakes. We talk about even things like the chocolate chip cookie or the microwave or the ice cream cone, things that kids love. Those all came about from mistakes. And I think if we can frame how really, really amazing things in their lives actually started as a mistake, it gives them a head of steam about the possibility that they can create from their mistakes as well.
And I guess if they see us not being afraid of making our own mistakes, that
Exactly.
it is transferable in that respect. And someone once asked me, so what if you weren't around, what would you want your kids to say about you? And it really tripped me up. I was like, oh God, I'm not sure. I guess I'd want them to say that I was always trying to make them curious and ambitious and kind and caring and the general things, but more about their sort of ability to explore and want to do things and that sort of stuff. And I guess that is learned through showing them and sharing them and trying to be an example of it. And part of that is obviously, as you say, mistakes. And we were chatting just before we hit record, weren't we, about one of your favorite chapters in the book is about mistakes. And you mentioned something like
Absolutely.
having an interview about mistakes. Tell me about it, because it sounded fascinating. I think it's something I'm going to
Yeah,
do.
so there's 60 activities as a whole of the book, so 10 activities per growth mindset principle.
Mm.
And there are some that I just naturally love, and we tested this in schools across the States and the UK. And there's one in particular called Bravery Mountain, where kids actually have a certain task and a goal, and we set it up not like a list, but we set it up as a mountain. And it's how are they going to climb the mountain, quite literally. But actually, and that one goes down an absolute storm. But the other one that's actually one of my favorites is called My Mistake Interview. And that's where we actually flip it on its head a little bit. And we ask the child to interview a grown up in their life about a mistake that they made. And they take on a role of journalist and they ask them about, what was the mistake? When did you do it? What did you learn from it? What could you have done better? And the reason we've done it, and the huge moments of like epiphany we've seen in children's eyes when they do it, is that when they can see the person who they would normally otherwise see as pretty much perfect,
Mm.
mistakeless, having actually made a mistake themselves, it normalizes it. And it's just, oh, okay, if daddy made a mistake, if mummy made a mistake, or if granddad or granny or aunt, uncle, um, parent, carer, whoever it may be, has actually made a mistake and they're still here and they're still doing fine and they're still in front of me and they give me everything I need, maybe mistakes are not such a bad thing after all. Maybe they're just part of the journey. And they have been massive, massive moments of epiphany. You can just see it in the child's face. They go, oh, oh, oh. So that's one of my favorites. But there's quite a few. I love Bravery Mountain. There's a whole dreaming big chapter as well, where we just basically challenge kids to say, reach for the moon,
Mm.
reach for the moon. What do you want to be? What would you love to do? And not necessarily even in like work, but just life,
Mm.
and some of the things there. But important to say as well, the book it's not just a writing book. There's a lot of opportunity to like draw and doodle. And so actually, as part of that chapter, one of the other exercises is drawing in the dark. Um, and as you can imagine, those are pretty messy drawings. But actually, what we do is we then ask the child and the grown up, well, what else could this be? Because even though it might look like a mess initially, if you can pick out little segments and say, well, actually, that part could have then been like that, or that part might turn into a spaceship, or actually, that part looks kind of like a superhero. It's amazing the sort of conversation that can just normalize
Mm.
the power of mistakes.
Wow, I love that. I mean, when back in 2020 during the first lockdown, I look back now and think one of the most rewarding things I did with my eldest at the time, well, it's still my eldest, but my eldest at the time was, the weather was nice. We were fortunate enough to have a garden, so there was times when we'd literally take a little chair out and he'd set up a little table and we'd have, I think it was a 5-10 minute conversation where he could ask me anything, because
Nice.
he struggles with his nerves a little bit, and I just want to make sure he was all right. And he'd set up and he'd take the little glasses of water out, he'd set a little plate up with some biscuits, and we'd go and sit there and he'd ask me anything. And it was almost like the ask me anything 10 minutes. And it was his opportunity to
Love
almost
that.
literally anything he wanted about anything, just to try and get out of his head what was in it, what might be stuck in it. And I love that focus around what you were saying about making it about mistakes and interviewing. I think it's a great format, because it should inspire a bit of confidence. Maybe the resilience word comes out of that as well, but shows that, yeah, mom and dad aren't flawless, but that's okay. Because I guess they are looking at you as that superhero who's made of iron. And well, sometimes things do go wrong. So making that specific time, I think, is a cracking one. I'm curious, Han-Son, I mean, it sounds like there's so much in the book. It's here, by the way, the Growth Mindset Workbook. I had a question around time that it takes to go through this. How much time should parents set aside per day, week? How much of it is self-study for the kids? How much is, because one of the pushbacks, no doubt, is going to be, I ain't got time to do that. So how much time are we going to take with our kids to do this? What's the frequency you'd recommend?
Honestly, so we road tested this with possibly I'd say nearly 100 parents actually across the UK and US, but before we put it live. And I would say the sort of theme is everyone used it totally differently. I actually went into the same hypothesis of you in terms of, so will we see people spending 10 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, or what will we see? I think particularly because we've structured it in such a way where it's kind of principle by principle. I'll be totally honest with you, it's absolutely up to you. And families have found a way to make it work for them. And for some, that's meant literally doing one task a day. For some, it's meant doing it kind of in bigger batches, but then in sort of smaller frequency, should we say?
Yeah.
But the one overall thing, and I'm not just saying this to sort of, big up the book, but the one thing we have seen is that when children get their hands on it, they don't want to put it down. So it might be more of a challenge to the parents to sort of say, put it down. And that's,
get off it.
Yeah, because I think there is, every child learns slightly differently. If you ask me if I have a recommended way, honestly, I don't, because the way we've designed it is for it to be child owned, but grown up guided.
Yes.
So it's the sort of thing that a child feels that it's their growth mindset book. But there are one or two activities that probably do need a little bit more grown up supervision, just because, well, for some activities like the mistake interview, they'll definitely be part of it. And there'll be others where we introduce concepts that are slightly older in some cases, but actually just may need a little bit of talking through. So I guess in answer to your question, without wanting to sit on the fence purposely, it just totally depends on your child's learning style.
Yeah, cool. So make some time. As parents, we have to just make a bit of time and discipline as we go. Yeah, brilliant.
And even that might just be initially. And I think I wouldn't necessarily want to say to parents, you have to, dedicate half an hour a week to this. I would say dedicate 15 minutes even, just as a start, and just see how your child wants to use it, because I think they will drive how it's used.
Yeah, great, because it's them to control it in a way, and they need our help to do it. Yeah, lovely. I mean, it is the growth mindset workbook. How can dads, parents get hold of it, Han-Son, and how can we find you? Where do we get you? Where do we find the book?
It's available on Amazon. It's £12.49, both in the States and the UK. So obviously in the States.com, Amazon.co.uk. If you just type in the Growth Mindset Workbook, you should see it. Otherwise, maybe, I don't know if as part of this, maybe we can kind of do a link to it or something.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And for me, so it's daddilife.com, so daddilife.com. And if anyone wants to drop me an email, I'm always happy to respond. I'm just a dad at daddilife.com.
Brilliant. Listen, Han-Son, it's been a cracking conversation about developing mindsets for kids. I think there's some real good takeaways. Before I let you go, what's next in terms of the growth mindset, in terms of Daddy Life work? What's next for you? What have you not done yet?
Well, in a way, I like that question. As I said right at the start, for me, we are entering probably the most exciting phase, and I don't mean this for Daddy Life, but I think dads as a whole, in terms of tackling some of those generational shifts. So whether it's our work with dads at work, whether it's our work but we're definitely going to do more books this year. We're definitely sort of growing more in terms of the site. I think there's just more really that's happening. But I think the thing that drives me personally is that I know that there's a long way that I think dads have come over the last sort of 5 years, but there's an awful lot more to go. And I think we are nowhere near the sort of conclusion of that mission. I'd love to sit here and say that we're no longer needed, sort of thing. And I think the day that we have a totally equalized parental world, that'll be awesome. But we're still quite away from it. So I guess we just want to drive more and more towards that.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, keep on with it, Han-Son. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Your mission is inspiring for many, I'm sure. And yeah, it's been a great conversation. Han-Son from Daddy Life, the Growth Mindset Workbook. Appreciate your time, buddy. Take care.
Thanks, Rob.